well, so I'm trying to keep this guided and that, we cover the topics that we're really here to talk about today. But I prepared a little intro about her. And I'll start with that.
Oh my.
So Elizabeth is a global disaster management, humanitarian relief, and Homeland Security specialist. She is currently an instructor at the University of South Florida, where she teaches on areas of emergency management, public health, and is focused on service learning projects. She has served for the American Red Cross as part of their disaster action team for the past 22 years. I did not know that. And in terms of academics, Elizabeth is a true USF Bull, having received her undergraduate degree in international studies, a master's in public health, and currently is pursuing a doctorate in public health as well. She's also an established author on a variety of academic articles, from food security to service learning to the complexity of disasters. And so we've kind of intentionally structured these fireside chats to kind of walk through a bit about how you got to where you are today, and to kind of make, all your crazy accomplishments seem like that they're achievable, right? You just got to put a little bit of hard work as you've done. And so I want to kind of talk through some different points of your life and kind of how you got to where you are.
All right, sounds good.
Perfect. So I kind of want to start off with just kind of your childhood. And so oftentimes, in this work, we try to think about the why behind the work that we do. And I know a little bit about your why, and it's extremely admirable. But for those in the room and for those listening, why are you here? What was your childhood like?
Yeah. So I actually grew up in Chicago until I was about 7 years old. And then we moved down to Texas. So I lived my whole K through 12 years in Texas, which is way different than the outskirts of Chicago. Chicago is very diverse. There's a lot of pockets of culture from all over the world in each different neighborhood. Texas was, way different in terms of living in the country, being very remote, living in very small communities, which was so different than up north. So each one had their differences in sense of community, which was very insightful when you're looking at just how communities engage and how people perceive you as an outsider and so forth. But, my mom actually, when we moved to Texas, she was a single mom with me and my brother, and she realized, okay, I need to go back to school. And so when I was 8, 9 years old, she was starting her college career. And I remember living in poverty. I remember, what it was like to, live in a neighborhood or a community that was low income, that we didn't have a car to get around. We had to share, little segments of food that were, barely enough for one person, let alone three. And so I saw just that progression of her going to school, and the more she got into her academics and the more she started working in the healthcare sector, I saw each year us kind of step up and do a little bit better, just because of that level of education and that drive, and that let's go from, living here in this low income HUD housing to, getting a little bit better housing structure with maybe more bedrooms or furniture. The first place we lived in, we didn't really have much furniture, and then, kind of moving in that direction. And so to see her start, graduate, and nobody believing that she would ever do it, as a high school dropout, as somebody that didn't want to go the track of education and say, I need to do better for my kids. That I saw kind of unfold. I was at a very, an age where that was very influential on my decision to want to go to college. It wasn't a question. It was, a real drive, because I would go with her because she didn't have maybe childcare. So I'd sit in the back of the class and watch her classes kind of unfold. So I think it now working in academia and going through all these different levels of education, I really do see the connection between, having that level of education and being able to kind of take that and formulate your career in a way that you can kind of progress and improve your life from living in poverty to, getting out of that. system of poverty.
I'm just so curious, 'cause I don't think I've ever really asked you that, but did those early experiences, were they really conscious, like were you conscious of how much they impacted your decisions? Like you mentioned, living in food insecurity, living in poverty.
Oh.
Did you think about, as you entered the food space, I'm going to do this because I experienced this? Or were this kind of like, I got into the space and then I remembered that I experienced this, right? Were those conscious decisions as you kind of went through life?
Yeah, I think the more, like, because I started off as a marine biologist,
Oh, I did
like
not know
studying,
that.
yeah, studying marine biology, and then I realized at the time I thought I had a fear of the ocean. I was like, can't really study something I'm scared of. I'm not scared of the ocean now. After learning how to scuba dive and having appreciation for it, I'm a little bit more. But I think the more classes I took, I started, taking more courses on literature and looking at the meanings of things and history and the connection between literature and history and how people write about things that influence the times, like policies or problems that are happening in our society that reflect in the stories that are told that may not have been, it might have been a fictional story, but things that are really happening in real world really influence a lot of what is told in fairy tales and stories, mm-hmm. right? And so, reflecting on all these things that are happening around the world really kind of showcase how, I don't know, how you perceive your own childhood, all the things that happen within your own life, and say, how can we do better? How can we make sure that, we're making that change or driving that change? Mm-hmm. So I think the more I started studying and the more I started thinking about some of the problems in our society, I guess I didn't realize it was a problem because it was my reality. Mm. And I could see my mom working really, really hard, and I think I thought that was really impactful in a way that, I know she was trying to do better. Mm. And so even though it was my normal and I was having fun as a child, I don't remember anything like too horrible.
Yeah.
But when you sit down and you reflect on it, you're like, oh, that's not normal to, share a can of tuna between 3 people and not have anything with it. And that's great. Like, we enjoyed it. Or just the fact that you slept on the floor or you didn't have a TV my mom was like, I didn't want TV to influence you. I didn't realize it was because we couldn't afford cable.
Right. Wow, we need to get your mom up here. Yeah.
But those are the things now reflecting back on it, I was like, wow, it kind of shaped who I am today because I appreciate little, different things that maybe people didn't appreciate in regards to seeing that struggle and seeing how, different things that shift your perspectives in your life as you're kind of learning more. So as you're taking each class and you're like, I guess I never thought about that, or I never thought about, how certain things we were doing actually helped build that resilience within our family unit, because we lived on a property where we can have a garden in the backyard and we can grow our own food, or we build those connections with neighbors, and when we needed something, we kind of relied on each other, and how that helps to build resilience not only within that sense of community, but the more I started learning and studying and focusing on the work that I did abroad once I graduated and going into post-conflict areas and seeing communities come together and work on projects and how those projects impact health, or how those projects impact economic development, or the recovery and sense of mental health, or, kind of getting past that conflict phase. It really resonated with me, the resilience of people. Mm-hmm. And then I shifted, living here in Florida, I really enjoyed being here in Tampa. Like, once I moved here, I felt like this was my community, like this was home. So even though I moved around a lot as a child, I moved almost every single year of my life after we left Chicago, lived in different cities all throughout Texas because my mom was going to different schools, taking on different jobs to get more experience or to kind of go up in her career. And I never felt like we had a sense of just staying in one place, and we were always trying to do better. So every time we moved, it was a jump. It was okay, let's move up to the next level. Mm-hmm. And so when I moved to Tampa, this is where I finally felt that sense of community.
Why do you think that was? What was it about Tampa that made you feel at home?
I think when I moved here, everybody else is a transient. And so when I would meet people, I mean, I met a lot of people from Florida, don't get me wrong, but
I
met,
barely have, so I'm surprised.
But at the beginning, yeah, there wasn't, almost everybody I would meet, they would be from other places. And I don't know, like being in Texas, usually a lot of people you meet in Texas are from Texas. So I was always called like a Yankee. And I'm like, wait, I'm not from New York, I'm from Chicago. Like, there's a difference. But everybody that was from the North, they were all Yankees. So it was, even though I felt the sense of community, it just wasn't, I never felt like I was like a Texan.
Yeah, always a little bit of an outsider.
Yeah. Whereas here, I think everybody's kind of an outsider, and then you got your locals. But it was definitely more welcoming to have people from all over the world, like meeting people from Ohio, Chicago, New York, you know, other part of Canada, you know, other parts,
all parts of North America.
Everywhere that's cold and everybody trying to get away. And so it was neat to kind of see that, you know, people coming together and just building this sense of community.
That's a really cool perspective on Tampa, especially when you consider our history of like Cubans and Germans and Italians settling this city. That's interesting that you got to experience it, you know, 100 years later or whatever, decades later, in your own experiences. And so what brought you to Florida? How'd you end up here?
So my mom actually moved here for a job.
Okay.
And I think she didn't want me to be too far away. So I was going to Texas A&M in Texas, and she convinced me to come here and study at USF. She's like, you know, look at some of the programs here, see if there's something that aligns with you, because I was transitioning out of marine biology. I realized I didn't like that. And so I didn't want to be in Texas alone. My brothers were here, my mom was here. All my other family was up in Chicago still. So I was like, you know what? I don't think it'll hurt to be close to family. So I hold my family in high regard. So, and especially my little brothers, and I didn't want to be too far from them because they were entering middle school at the time. And it's one thing being a couple hours away and being able to visit every, you know, couple months or something, like when you're in school, to not really having that luxury to kind of just come home.
And so you ended up getting your undergrad in international studies. So that pivot from marine biology to international studies, how'd you get there?
So actually, yeah, good question. I don't know. I actually started studying international studies because I was drawn to global humanitarian issues. I actually started working here in Tampa. I started working at an auto parts store actually when I first started working or living here. And I met somebody that I worked with that was from Bosnia.
Oh.
Yeah. And he was, I think, a year older than me, or 2 years older than me. And he, I had to interview somebody for a class assignment that was different than me. It could be somebody older and me being younger, somebody male, I'm female. And it was like an ethics class. And I was like, well, I want to interview this guy that I work for because he said he fled a war. And I was like, he's this 6'5" white guy with blonde hair, blue eyes that's 20 years old. And I'm like, what war did he flee from? I was actually really confused. I was like, And then when I started learning more, I interviewed him and I started learning more about Bosnia, which was in Europe, Eastern Europe. And I didn't realize when I was in high school or middle school, high school in the 90s, he was surviving, you know, acts of genocide and living in a war-torn area of the world that I literally had no clue was even going on. And so for me, I think I was really driven. Oh, thank you. I think I was really driven by the fact that I didn't know what was going on in the world when I'm, you know, sitting here struggling with my normal high school stuff, that some people my same exact age are going through things that are absolutely horrendous, whether it be, you know, a humanitarian emergency or conflict or a natural disaster or something that is absolutely detrimental to their safety and their life, and they're resilient and they survive and they strive to, you know, go to school. Like he was in school and he wanted to become an architect and he wanted to, you know, do better and build his community back, you know, what it was like before the war. And then I started meeting more Bosnians because we actually get a large influx of refugees here in the Tampa Bay area. and I still work very closely with the refugee community here, actually. And the more Bosnians that I met that were at USF, they were going to law school because they wanted to fight against human rights violations, or they wanted to go into the United Nations to help with humanitarian work, or whatever the case may be. So I was actually starting to kind of go in that direction of I wanted to learn more about what was happening globally. And I also started taking classes in economic development. And so I actually have a degree in economics, and I also have a degree in international relations.
Oh, okay.
So I have the two because I was focusing more on post-conflict recovery. And that's what ended up leading me into, I was working overseas on different projects. I actually got to go to Bosnia and work with the Center for Peace Building there, and got to learn what they were doing in regards to transitional justice and moving past that, the conflict, and into a redevelopment phase or reconstruction phase. And so that was a huge kind of focal area that I was working in. I got to go to Vietnam, Cambodia, and Thailand and look at some of the projects they were doing with water infrastructure and wells to combat different waterborne diseases, and working with high school and middle schoolers that were focusing, and college students that were focusing on the Millennium Development Goals with the UN and striving to meet those benchmarks. So,
and you're doing this all at like 22, 25?
24, 25.
Okay.
Yeah. And
Crazy.
then when I came back to the States, somebody mentioned to me a master's program that focused on global disaster management and humanitarian relief within the field of public health. And the first thought I thought of was my mom being a nurse. And I was like, I do not want to do nursing. I have no interest in that. And they're like, no, public health is way different than nursing. You know, you're focusing on entire populations. You're not focusing on one individual person. Like your goal is to look at driving change in the community. And I was like, And so I decided to take a couple classes actually with my mom.
Oh.
Yeah. She wanted to go back to get her master's, but she was scared of going back to school in her, 40s or whatever at the time. 40s or 50s. And so I said, you know what, I'll take a couple classes in this area just because I'm fascinated with the humanitarian side of it, and help you like ease into it, and we'll kind of go from there. And so I took a couple online classes with her, and we would get into some really good debates on some of the topics. It was actually a very, really cool bonding experience.
Cool, yeah.
Because we could talk about the topics of that week and kind of dive into it and study together and stuff like that. And then she went a different track than me. So she got her MPH, but it was in healthcare management, not what I
How fun
did.
getting your MPH alongside your mother. Like that's such a great experience.
Oh, we were really competitive.
Yeah.
Like if she took a biostats class before me and then I got a lower grade than her on an exam that she took, she would let me know. She's like, my grade was higher for that one. And I was like, okay, I get it. So it was kind of fun. It kept me on my toes. But it also let me think about the disaster side, which I wasn't focused on at first. And so I actually went with the Red Cross up to Hurricane Sandy, and I got to respond as a shelter manager during the response during Hurricane Sandy. And then after that, I transitioned into working into the Red Cross headquarters and coordinating all volunteers that were coming into Manhattan and dispersing them to the 5 boroughs to respond to Hurricane Sandy. So that, to me, I realized the connection point between global humanitarian conflict and reconstruction and natural hazards, even what is happening in our own backyards when it comes to hurricanes or large-scale disasters. When you're working in a resource-limited area and you're focusing on all the different moving parts of building that community back and that sense of resiliency, whether it's a conflict area, whether it's a disaster affected area, a lot of the same, there's such similar correlation between those impacted communities.
So I think for this room, at least, because I know your background, and Marcus, you know Elizabeth, so I'm assuming you kind of know these pillars. But I think for those listening to this recording later on, I think understanding exactly what global disaster management entails in emergency response, and maybe if you could share kind of some of those like key pillars of the work. I think a lot of people think about it in terms of rapid response, like the emergency side of it all. But what I've come to learn is a lot more of the planning that needs to take place in order to be prepared. So can you kind of speak to that balance a little bit? And what is, today where there's no immediate emergency happening, what is disaster preparedness look like?
I hear it all the time. I'll talk to somebody and they're like, well, I got into emergency management because I thought, if there's no hurricanes going on, I'm just kind of hanging out and waiting for things to happen. And you're like, what? There's a lot of behind the scenes work going on all year round to prepare for hurricane season. And even when you're in hurricane season, you're talking about any other kind of emergency that could happen that you're trying to just make sure your community is prepared for across the board. So
like in Tampa, right? With our
Yeah.
hurricanes, our seawall,
oh, there's so much different vulnerabilities that you have to consider, and you have to understand what your vulnerabilities are. So when you were saying planning, I think in emergency management, everybody always thinks about that response. You know, when something happens, I think they're focused so much more on, you know, what fire or police are doing and just being in that action. Well, emergency management is really the coordinating body of that, and they're the ones that are making sure that the resources are there, or making sure ahead of time that you're thinking about those mitigation measures to reduce risk to your critical infrastructure, that like your hospitals, your food systems,
right.
you know, fueling, transport, getting all those first responders out there, you know, all the different things that they might have or need. And then getting them prepared for those things too, because, you know, even though they're operating day in and day out, you know, responding to an incident where it's a 5-car pileup is way different than 200 victims that have been affected by, you know, a gas release out of the port, or, you know, an active, you know, shooter that has come in, or like if there is a touchdown of a, you know, tornado in a community and doing the search and rescue in the houses that are affected, or all those different kind of moving parts take training. They take sitting back and evaluating that response and saying, how can we do better? And we year round, we are constantly doing exercises with different agencies and organizations like TICO or the port, or, you know, Tampa General Hospital, or all these different kind of moving parts in terms of making sure everybody knows how to do what they do, but in times of high, you know, stress, or in times of, you know, when there's a surge of patients or a surge of, you know, needs in terms of that response. But ultimately, emergency management works under 4 pillars. They're looking at preparedness and mitigation measures ahead of time. They're looking at how can they strengthen that response, but also what it takes to recover from anything that might occur. And in that, you're wanting to make sure that you're mitigating the risk for next time. So you want to build back better. You don't want to build exactly the same it was done before, or just rush it, because then you might be making the same exact mistakes you made the first time. So there's a lot of intricacies within it. And unfortunately, in emergency management, a lot of these agencies only have, you know, 10, you know, 5, 10 people operating and doing this all year round. And so unfortunately, because of the workload, or because of the planning and preparedness that goes into it, maybe they can't focus on all the answers. And then in times of disaster, there has to be, you know, we have to work as a community. We can't just rely on that small team within the Department of Emergency Management. We have to have partners in all these different organizations and agencies and all the businesses throughout Hillsborough County to make sure our response is adequate, right?
Yeah, I actually never thought about the human. I always kind of thought of emergency management as like, you know, nature versus the people, but the human violence component of it, you know, like that active shooter situation, that didn't, so I learned something just there. What about from a community member standpoint? What can they do to be more disaster resilient?
That is a really good question.
Yeah.
So when I talk to a lot of people, a lot of business owners, so not even just individual like households, but also businesses in the community, or churches, there's something that's kind of very reoccurring. So for one, individuals always assume that maybe the government's going to help them and save them. And that's not always the case. So, you know, there's only so much capacity that the government can do within a rapid amount of time. So being prepared is going to be, you know, preparing your household and you is going to be utmost importance. So that's why they say, you know, make sure that you have 7 days worth of food and water. Because if you're stranded or you're isolated and somebody can't get to you within a certain amount of time because of the damage or destruction of, say, a hurricane or something like that, then you have to be self-sufficient. And I think people just automatically assume if I don't evacuate, somebody will come save me, or or they don't realize that, yeah, maybe they're not in an evacuation zone, but everything around them is in an evacuation zone. So now they're trapped. Like we saw that a lot in Hurricane Ian, where somebody was in, I don't know, an evacuation zone D, but they were surrounded by evacuation zone B, and that was all underwater and they couldn't leave their house. So I think just having that personal knowledge that you need to make sure that you're prepared for any sort of emergency is going to be really, really important. But also for businesses and like faith-based communities or nonprofits that, you know, operate day in and day out in a non-emergency state, having them sit down and think about, one, how are they going to continue the operations that they already do? But how do they plug into the emergency management system?
Yeah.
So what is their disaster role? So even if they're a car dealership here in Tampa, you know, what are they going to do during a disaster to help support their community in recovery? I know I've actually, you know, talked to different companies that have been like, well, I don't know how I can plug in or how I can help. And those conversations need to be had before an incident occurs, not when something's happening.
And is the Emergency Operations Center the single point of like information on that? Like, is there a resource you could point people towards to get plugged in?
Yeah. So what's really cool is our communities, especially like Hillsborough County, we have something called a COAD. It's a community organizations active in disasters. And so we try to bring people to the table from all different kind of sides of, you know, businesses and nonprofits and anybody that would be organizing during an emergency to help. And so coming to the table and having those conversations and saying, okay, what can I do to make sure that I'm playing my part and helping with that level of resilience could be a big, you know, part.
Yeah, I think joining, being part of Well-Built Cities and being a part of the food system in such a way that it reaches marginalized communities has really made me acutely aware over the past 3 years about the role of everybody in an emergency situation. Because Hurricane Ian, right? That's the last one that just happened. I was all the way in Kansas City, and I was fielding phone calls for a week about what we were going to do in the event of Hurricane Ian hitting Tampa, because it was on the path to here. And I had no idea. And it made me so frustrated with the fact that, one, I hadn't prepared myself in that way, but two, that wasn't a bigger push. And I mean, COAD exists, but like there should be an emergency management professional in every business, right? Like, and I know that's not possible.
That would be my dream.
Yeah, and I know it's not possible, but I feel like it's such a necessity, especially in an area like Tampa that is so prone to natural disasters. And I mean, so many of our nation cities are also prone to, they're built underwater, right? And so it made me acutely aware of it. And since that, I've been very focused on, okay, how could we do better and plan for that kind of situation?
And I can actually add on to that. So even though we do have the COAD, that's one option, right? And there's also ways in which you can connect. So based on resiliency research, we do see that social networks and social connections are a sign or a component of resilience. So the stronger connections within a community or within those organizations or agencies or even businesses, the more connected they are in terms of knowing who to contact or get in touch with to solve problems or identify solutions or to plug in.
Which is why everyone was calling me.
And that's big. Like, so even if you're connecting with other groups, it doesn't have to be the COAD. It could be Homegrown Hillsborough. And it could be, you know, different groups that are coming together, you know, the chamber. The idea is that, you know, you want to align yourself or connect yourself with those things. Other things that, like, for instance, I'm the director of our USF Community Emergency Response Team. And, like, for example, TICO has something called a Business Emergency Response Team. The zoo has been talking about bringing on their business emergency response teams. So a lot of different organizations, a lot of faith-based communities also have their own CERT teams. So community emergency response teams are called CERTs. And so, you know, training them in that level of, like, it's a FEMA-based training that takes course over about, you know, it depends how, about 24 hours. So it could be over a 7-week period, it could be over a 3-day period. But the content within it actually helps to train individuals about thinking, like, to think about their own preparedness in a wide range of potential threats and how they can make sure that not only they're prepared, but how can they respond in their communities if first responders can't get there in time? So how to do, like, think about their own safety and not just running in somewhere and putting themselves at danger, but how can they mobilize the community? How can they assist or help if there is that immediate need, so that they can take action and not just assume that somebody else is gonna come in and save the day.
Yeah, and preparedness, like the 7 days recommendation of food, right? Are you gonna have power to cook that food? How much of that food is edible? How much of that food is gonna go to waste?
Yeah.
And so I bring up food a couple times. One, because that's where we got to overlap and kind of work with your work with refugee populations and teaching them about kind of food in emergency situations and just in general. And I always think it's fascinating because you have this crossover of food, education, emergency management, and like a million other things, if you know Elizabeth. But what's like the center note of that? Do you have you thought about that, or?
I mean, everything I do is centered around resilience.
Okay.
And so the way I see it, and I try to explain this to some people, if you have a healthy community, if you're focusing on building that sense of connection and people feeling like they're part of that community, it's moving towards that level of resilience.
Yeah.
And so whether there's a disaster here or not, if you're building towards a healthy, prosperous, engaged, socially connected, empowering communities, looking at subsects of the community and different communities that have, just different disparities in general in day-to-day life, that's just a piece of the puzzle, and making sure that they feel confident in either contacting the right people in case they're in need, having the right resources that they need to respond in times of a disaster, but also having those conversations ahead of time that say, hey, I'm glad that you're part of this program right now. We're looking at food insecurity and this and that. Have you thought about, if there's a hurricane, how you would access food, or how you would leave your house if you need to evacuate? So everything that I do with the refugee community, or with all these different sub-communities that I've engaged with, whether it's community gardens and this and that, there's a sense of resiliency behind all of it. So even just if we're working within the food system, for example, and having, all these different kind of nodes where people know, okay, during the pandemic, if I'm a farmer, where do I take my produce? Because I don't want to see it go to waste when there's need. Not all those farmers have those connections to know exactly who to contact to donate that food to somewhere that can then get it to the populations that are needing that. But
I think that's a great answer. I mean, I think resilience, it always brings me back to the story of there's a local farm called Rosebud Continuum, and Dr. Culhane runs it, and Dr. Culhane is this like super, liberal and like colorful and just a fantastic individual, and he does Rosebud from the perspective of like environmental sustainability and living like sustainably and off the grid, and he partners with a Texas rancher who's this big, this man was like 6'4" easily, like probably taller. He looked taller than my dad. And he's this, staunch kind of Republican. I mean, I'm maybe projecting a bit, but, grew up Texas ranching cattle, and he does it from like the apocalypse, doomed his day, like disaster management. I'm not giving my waste to anybody. I'm going to use it. And they just have such different perspectives, but this shared goal of resiliency. Yeah. And so I think that's a really good framing, because I do see that in all the work that you do. All right, we're going to get into some kind of fun questions here, because believe it or not, we've already been chatting for like half hour.
Really?
Yeah. The first time I met Elizabeth, we talked for 2.5 hours. Yeah, I think we had an hour
I'm
meeting.
sure you're reducing that.
Yeah, exactly. I think we chatted for a really long time. So one of the kind of goals of these conversations that we're having is to really, again, show people that these visions we have for not just Tampa, but for whatever spaces we're in, are really achievable through kind of hard work. And hard work comes with all the positives and also all the negatives. And so could you, we're talking about disaster management. On your journey to it, what kind of blew up in your face? What was a challenge that you had to overcome to get to the other side?
Yeah, I'd have to say when you're new in the field and you're kind of going into the profession, building that trust. And so building that trust at the beginning, say you want to get into emergency management, say you want to work in community work in general, building that trust can make or break whether you are successful or not, right? So I think having every opportunity to engage and talk with people and build that skill, those soft skills that we sometimes we don't gain, and especially with the age of technology that are sometimes being lost.
Yeah.
I think that's really, really important. Like, how can you approach somebody and convince them to listen to you? To convince them or to inspire them to want to do more or to take action or to, I don't know, just
And so have you
be there.
experienced the hardship in that? Like, what are some
I would have
examples?
to say so, yeah. Just one example, during Hurricane Sandy, I remember working in the shelters and coming in as somebody that's not a New Yorker. I had people that weren't very nice to me and were very rude and just like that would say things that were just, I'm like, I'm here to help you.
Like what?
I'm
Give
so
us an
surprised.
example.
Like for example, like I had a woman that I think I was giving her, like, some Girl Scouts donated some cookies, and I was giving her cookies, and she had it, like, her napkin out, and she put the cookies in there, and she goes, poured them on the plate. She goes, again.
Oh.
And I was like, okay. And I put the cookies back on her plate, and she emptied them again. She goes, again. She did it 4 times, and I was like, I'm really confused right now.
Like she was throwing them out after you gave them to her?
Yeah,
Oh.
like she was being very, like, abrasive.
Huh.
And I'm like, why is she being so mean to me? Everybody loves Girl Scout cookies.
Yeah.
And so she just, like, little mannerisms like that to me, that's like one that really stands out to me. Like, she did a whole bunch of other things over the course of the next few days. But after being there for about a week, she came up to me and she apologized. And she was like, I'm so sorry that I treated you the way that I've treated you the last week. Because I figured you were going to be like every other volunteer that comes in for a couple hours, leaves, doesn't come back. I never see you again. But you actually come back every single day, even though we're mean to you. And I feel like you actually listen to us and you care.
Yeah.
And so that to me kind of resonated because, I don't know, I guess I didn't realize that a lot of people were being mean to me at first because I was that outsider, even though they weren't saying it.
Yeah.
And then when people were, like, apologizing or breaking things down, by the time we actually ended up, I want to say a month in, it was around Thanksgiving, they actually invited me to Thanksgiving dinner because they were like, you're part of the family. You're part of the Staten Island, like, you're like family. You have to be here, you know? And so it was neat to kind of feel that, you know. Or we've done when we were doing some work in recovery in Bosnia, we were doing an activity where we had to actually share something that was extremely traumatizing, and to kind of break down where we were on the cycle of not being angry, but moving past anger and having that acceptance and forgiveness. And everybody in the room was like, well, I have my one thing in my head, but nobody wanted to share.
Yeah.
And I think it's because
Hard.
you have to be very vulnerable. You have to share something that's, like, maybe hard for you to say out loud. And I know when it came to me, I actually was like, you know what, I'm going to share with you mine. And I talked about being in a very abusive relationship and where I was in that path and how it took me a little while to forgive that person, and what I had to overcome to get to that point. And all of a sudden, after I kind of shared something that brought me, that vulnerability out, all of a sudden, all these other refugees were starting to share their stories and their experiences, and they started reflecting on where they stood in their recovery. And so I think at a younger age, it made me realize sometimes you have to be a little vulnerable. Sometimes you have to, be able to look at somebody and actually listen to them or have that conversation to build that trust before, they're going to give it to you.
Yeah.
You have to earn it before.
There's reciprocity in relationships.
Yeah,
I think we
100%.
forget about. I think especially in sometimes the go of the day-to-day of American culture, right? You kind of forget that we're all human. And like today I was at a farm and there was a processing of a chicken, and I just had so much joy in watching like this chicken die. But I mean, just the skill of learning how to do it, and I was so excited to be learning. And I think we forget I had a moment of presence. And the fact that I recognize the moment of presence goes to show you how little of that I do. Yeah. And so that's in that reciprocity, that vulnerability.
Oh, 100%.
Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah.
So in the outdoor rec world, we do roses and thorns. And so we always end with the rose. And we're not going to end, but the rose. So what are you most proud of? And what are you most proud of?
Yeah. I'd have to say I got into academia and working at the university because it was something different and unique, and it wasn't what I expected. And I thought, as soon as I get bored with this, then I'll go back into the field. It'll be just a stepping stone into maybe something, different. But, I'm young enough to have one career, maybe 3 other careers, whatever. And the more I got into working at USF and working with students, and then also looking at how I can work with community partners, that's probably been my biggest, because you're inspiring the next generation and you're trying to set them up for success and making sure that they understand maybe some of the little tools that they can have in their toolkit to help lead them or launch them into their career. But also looking at ways in which we can leverage, when we talk about in emergency management, we talk about a whole community approach and involving everybody in our communities in that response and preparedness and mitigate, like all those different kind of phases, right? And a lot of times academic institutions are underutilized. So whether it be the manpower of students or, the research behind something or engaging with, a project or initiative, or I think that's been probably my one, proud moment in terms of what we've accomplished.
And I can attest to the fact that you've achieved that, because I've worked with so many USF professors and you outshine the rest of them. And really, because sometimes volunteer work is harder to facilitate than it really reaps rewards. And we do it regardless of the fact, because we want to provide people with that same experience and that toolkit. And we call them, the drive-by volunteers. And it can be really challenging, as someone who also is passionate about academics, to stick the course and train up a volunteer and teach them all the things and spend all your time, and then they're just gone within moments. But working with your students and working with the organizations with you have always really provided value. And the first refugee showcase we did now is a long-standing Hispanic heritage showcase in that community, right?
That's awesome.
Put the value in through your passions.
Yeah.
So I want to attest to it there. And then also personally, the first time I met you, I came home raving, and my boyfriend Will, who was your student, knew exactly who you were just by how much I was raving, and then raved back, and he had raved about you first. I think I told you, I already knew who you were because I heard about you as a professor and how much you do pour into your students. So I can attest to the fact that you really should be proud of that. Okay, so some fun questions. So 2 or 3 books that you would suggest to people here, people listening?
Yeah, so I have a list that I definitely think from one standpoint. I'm going to use my notes.
Cheat here, yeah.
I was going to say one book that I think everybody should read, and this is what I always tell a lot of people from the standpoint of, I know I work with a lot of refugees, but also thinking about, our built environment, when it comes to racism in America. The Warmth of Other Suns by Isabel Wilkerson is one of my top books. I think every person should read this book because it gives perspective here in the United States that it's just so well written and so designed in a way that you're understanding or seeing the perspective from different individuals that have had to migrate from the South to the North, and just a lot of things that were happening, along the way. So that's one book that I literally think every single person should read.
And you said it kind of fast, so it's The Warmth of Other Suns,
Yeah,
right?
The Warmth of Other Suns. And then the other one that I always recommend is What the Eyes Don't See. It's a story of crisis resilience and focusing on the Flint, Michigan crisis with the water. And it actually tells a perspective of the whistleblower who actually was a refugee from Iraq, and she became a pediatrician, and she started seeing high levels of lead in children's blood, and she fought to bring this awareness to the local government and emergency management and public health and everybody else. And a lot of people didn't want to listen to her, and it kind of showcases how she tried to use the data to prove and showcase what was going on, and how she had to have, jump through all these hoops to voice a concern that she was seeing. But I always use this example, especially in my classes, is, don't just not do anything because you don't know, either you don't know how to do it, or you say, well, that's beyond my scope of work, and just sit back and let people, be affected by whatever type of crisis that is going on. Just having that power to voice your concerns and speak up and, be that voice to protect others, because those children can't protect themselves in that case. And there's many cases around the world where people see things and don't say anything. Yeah. And that's a really big one. And then the last one I was thinking about was The Unthinkable. And that one's my disaster book, because I remember the first time I read it, it tells like different case stories of different people and examples of people and how they either freeze and not respond to an emergency situation, they act without thinking and they put themselves in harm, or they stop and they assess the situation and respond accordingly, based on the facts and what they see in the situational awareness. And I know as a new person in emergency management, I was so scared I was going to be like that freezer, that I wasn't going to, take action. I wasn't going to do anything. I was going to feel overwhelmed and just shut down. And I think that it's nice to kind of see that with the level of training and with certain, levels of knowledge and awareness, you can build that sense of resiliency and that sense of strength, and having the capability to respond in times of emergency, whether it be a personal emergency in your home or with your family, or just handling, a personal crisis or a crisis on a community level. I think it's just really amazing to think through and process how different people act different ways, and it could be because of the levels of training or how you can overcome those things. So
those are some great suggestions. And Elizabeth also shared she read 40 books so far this year. So these are very, I think you're like an expert in book recommendations if you read 40 and it's April. So definitely check those ones out. I'm going to check out the Flint, Michigan one. Yeah. Just because water is such a pressing issue here in Tampa, and especially what's happening in South County where people turned on their taps and there wasn't water. That's one that I think is a lot more, it's not so far away for what could be. I mean, hopefully it's not contaminated, but we have a water issue here in Tampa. 100%. So that's cool. I'm going to check that one out. All right. So, I'm sure so many people get inspired by you, but what's the most innovative or inspiring person you've met?
Good question. I would have to say, I'd have to say the people that have inspired me are people that, when I hear their stories of resilience, where you're sitting here going, how do you keep going on after you've experienced all the things that you've done? And you're still sitting at the table, you're still pushing forward. I have so many examples of that where I've met individuals where I'm like, wow, especially my refugee women that we work with.
They're incredible, yeah.
You hear each story and you're just like, how are you sitting here today? And to me, it's like, that is inspiration enough. So people that have been affected by disasters and have lived, front and center in some of these horrendous circumstances, whether it be natural hazards or man-made and conflict or whatever the case may be, and to still say, I'm showing up, I'm doing what I can, I'm doing what I can for my family, or people coming forward and helping others when they've already lost everything and they're on the front lines trying to help other people in their journey to recovery. To me, that is just, I'm not even doing anything compared to some of these individuals that I come across.
I vividly remember, and now I wonder if you helped organize it, but when I was in university, they did a panel of refugee kids. So these were like 12-year-olds. Yeah. And I attended it, and they had some questions prepared about where they came from and all that jazz. And then questions from the audience started coming. And they were things like, oh, do you, now that you have to go to school, like, do you wish you did it because, school sucks? And these kids were like, I get to go to school. Like, what do you mean it sucks? Yeah. And these kids had already shared experiences of being bullied because they're from other countries. And they were like, so there's no bombs. So bullying's okay. Like they were just
Everything's
so
perspective, yeah.
shocked by these questions, and just being 12-year-olds, they had no, there was no going around the question. They were saying, yeah, no, I don't like McDonald's. I like food. Like what like they were just so blatantly confused by the most basic questions, because for them it was the only answer was there's no war.
Yeah.
I don't hear bombs. Like,
or the idea of that they feel lucky that they even have this option. When back home they didn't have that option.
And we talk a lot about that with the food system refugees. Why we did that program was because these refugee women weren't accessing food resources like food banks and community gardens, because they didn't feel they were in need, even though they were going hungry.
They thought somebody was more deserving of it than them.
And because they come from a refugee camp or an area torn in conflict, and they were teachers and businesswomen, and so they saw poverty when in their countries to the extreme, and just didn't feel like they were in poverty, regardless of the fact that the homes we picked them up for were impoverished homes, right? And so really, really inspiring stuff. And so I want to just take a little bit of time here to end our time here today. And again, thank you everybody for coming. And I hope that this is well listened to, because Elizabeth just has so much value to bring into the world. And this is really designed to highlight people like you. And so if there's anybody here who has a suggestion for an upcoming one, like I want to bring your mom out because I feel like her story, and she's VP of something now. What's your mom's title now?
She's been working as a COO of home health agencies.
Okay, so from a single mom in poverty to a COO of a home health agency. But if anybody has suggestions, we're open to hearing them. But for all the value you bring into the world over the next few years, what should we focus on, in your opinion, to bring more beauty and value into our world and community?
Yeah, I think for us here in Hillsborough County, we're developing beyond what we projected even before the pandemic. I think now people are working remotely. We're having a lot more people move to the state of Florida. For me, I would like to see us really, think about development here in Tampa in terms of what mitigation measures we can be putting into place, because some of the conversations I have when certain development is occurring is what mitigation measures have been, retrofitted in buildings in downtown Tampa with, certain, new either proposals or platforms. And a lot of times the architect or the individual will say, well, we haven't really retrofitted anything to withstand, storm surge, or we really haven't thought about the risks that are being proposed in some of these developments, like, developing in certain coastal areas that are, evacuation zone A, or could potentially have 30-foot storm surge, 20-foot storm surge with the right conditions. We need to be making sure that we're building in a way that is going to withstand that water or withstand hurricane force winds. Like, how can we make sure that we're talking with emergency management or with people that are experts in building that resilience and mitigation to that built infrastructure, but also thinking about the vulnerable populations that live in some of these subsects. Like, how can we make sure that they're better prepared for hurricanes? Because we've gone into many neighborhoods with the Office of Emergency Management in partnership with them, with the students, and gone door to door and said, okay, do you know that you're in an evacuation zone? Do you know what your plan is? Here's some resources. Let's have a conversation. And I have talked to so many people that have said, well, I've lived here for 70 years. I never knew I was in a flood area. I've never seen flooding before. And you're trying to explain to them, well, if a hurricane were to come and we had the right conditions, you would see pretty high levels of water in your neighborhood. And I think that's very eye-opening when they look at the map and they sit down and you kind of talk through those conversations. But I think we need to do better in terms of preparing not only those that have already lived here for so long that just haven't experienced that, but also all the new people that are coming into Florida that don't know what to expect. Because I think Hurricane Ian was very eye-opening, but also, and Hurricane Idalia, the last couple, storm seasons. Hurricane Irma was definitely a shaker in 2017 in terms of the whole state of Florida. But I think we need to make sure that we're, thinking about that level of, community development and getting the word out and helping people understand how to be better prepared and how to build better, how we can make sure these developments that are coming in can withstand, water, flooding, storm surge, wind speeds. Like, how can we do better in our development?
Mm-hmm. I think that's some great advice, and especially with the rapid growth of Tampa.
Yeah.
And I mean, I can't even say past few years, it's constant. And I think Tampa has the most cranes next to Miami in Florida. Anyone verify that fact?
Most what?
Most cranes up next to Miami.
I wouldn't doubt it.
Or something like that. So don't quote me on that. But I'm pretty sure I heard that statistic because Toronto has the most cranes up next to Miami. And I heard Tampa wasn't far behind at the state level. Does anyone here have any questions? Yeah, I think you can just scream it out. I'll repeat it, Nick.
I guess my question is, since you started in disaster management, have you seen community attitudes towards disaster management change? Like, is there more buy-in now because of seeing more disasters? Or
Can I repeat it before you answer it?
Yeah.
So just so the recording can have it. So since starting in disaster management, have you seen more community buy-in to disaster management? Because of all the things that have gone on?
Yeah, so when I first got in, actually, I want to say Florida hadn't been touched by a hurricane for like 10 years, and I had started like right at the beginning of that 10-year mark. And for 10 years, I think people became really complacent. They hadn't really seen any storm systems come here. And then when Hurricane Irma came in 2017, and then we had the pandemic, which is another form of disaster, right? And you can see just systems collapsing around us. And then you see Hurricane Ian, which everybody's like, oh my, this is, scary, too. And then Adalia was a little bit of a, heading north, but
Hiccup,
still people were like, what's that thing doing? I think that people are now, especially after Hurricane Ian, and they saw the number of deaths along the coastline of people that refuse to evacuate. I'd like to think that people are going to take it more seriously, but we've done a lot of evacuation research and interviewed people right after Hurricane Ian. Most of the responses we got were from Pinellas County, only because majority of Pinellas County will be underwater if we get the right conditions with storm surge. And almost everybody we were interviewing, like the emergency manager there, was very concerned because she's like, we issued the evacuation orders and people weren't evacuating. Why not? Like, what's going on? Can you please do a little bit of research to try and figure out what is the problem? And the thing is, a lot of them were waiting. Like, I'm just gonna wait and see if it comes here. If you wait and see if the storm comes here, it's too late to get out. Because when they give you that order and they say you need to get out now, it's because it's gonna take about 48 to 72 hours to evacuate people off of that peninsula because of the roadways. And you cannot evacuate when the wind speeds get up to about 35 miles an hour because it will push your car off of the road. Also, a lot of people don't realize that 911 will not respond to calls after 40-mile-an-hour winds, which is, I mean, it depends on the jurisdiction, but on average about 40-mile-an-hour winds, 40, 45 at the most. And so that means that's not a lot. Like, that's not even close to a tropical storm. So if your house is on fire or your father has had a heart attack, and you need 911 to respond, I think people don't realize nobody's going to be able to come until those wind speeds die down. And so I think, trying to get that message out, trying to explain this is why we tell you to evacuate, because if electricity is out or if you have somebody with a chronic illness or something that could lead to other problems or complications if you don't evacuate, you need to leave. And so a lot of the deaths that we saw in Hurricane Ian, there was I mean, the number is kind of different. I think it depends on, which number you look, but about 147 people died in Hurricane Ian. And out of most of them, it was mostly either due to drowning because they didn't evacuate, or complications due to medical needs, again, because of the evacuation challenges. And so it could be that they were like electricity dependent and they thought, oh, well, I'm fine, I'm not in an evacuation zone, but then their electricity shut off and now they didn't have a way to charge their, their machine or equipment that provides oxygen, or they couldn't get their medications refrigerated. And so I think it brought to light to a lot of things, but it depends if those individuals were paying attention to those intricacies or not and trying to convey that. So I think the big message that we really did see was everybody was just kind of waiting. They wanted to wait and see if it was coming. And I think we just need, if I can just get that message across to people that, you know, listening to your emergency manager, they don't take those evacuation orders lightly. It's better to be safe than sorry. Like, we were very fortunate that it did not affect Pinellas County and Hillsborough County necessarily to the degree that it affected Lee County or Charlotte. But if that were to happen here, I can guarantee it would have been much worse, because that area down south is not as populated as Pinellas County or Hillsborough County, right? And so if those individuals won't evacuate or didn't evacuate in time, we would have seen a lot more effects. So hopefully, you know, in recent, usually when something happens, people will respond accordingly based on the memories that they have. But usually when we go a few years past it, they become a little bit more complacent again, and we have to try and reiterate the importance of it. And we got to keep, you know, getting that message out. So I think just making sure that you're doing your part and you're encouraging people to evacuate. Or a lot of people will say they'll see that their neighbors are evacuating. They're like, well, they're all evacuating. Maybe I should evacuate. So even just if you do something to kind of, you know, do your part, you'll be surprised how other people will kind of turn to you as a leader, or somebody that they should listen to in terms of, you know, that decision making. So I think it's a small step. So we try to train as many people in that knowledge and letting people know, which is very hard, because when you have 1.5 million people and you're trying to convince them to know their evacuation zone and to take action if they need to take action, each household is very different. Like, you can't, you know, even if you're in a non-evacuation zone, you still might need to evacuate based on your situation or your, you know, your family. So knowing your family and knowing how to build your plan according to the needs of your family is really, really important. Yeah.
Did you see more response from, because, you know, I was having this debate in my head, if I'm poor, am I more likely to go because I have less to lose, or am I less likely to go because this is what all my resources are here, versus if I'm better off, like, I think about myself, I have a generator, right? I'm not in a flood zone. The odds, I'm, you know, in a neighborhood that I've heard that the trees cut the wind and the storm, like, I'm less likely to go because I think I'm prepared. Anyways, is there statistics that could support who actually evacuates versus who doesn't?
Yeah, so we've actually done some research on that too. We found that people that are homeowners are actually less likely to evacuate than those that are renters, because they're like, I need to protect my house. I need to be here so that I can protect it. And you're like, I think I had a conversation with my dad. He just moved here from Chicago a few years ago. He's like, I'm staying here during Hurricane Ian because if the shingles come off the roof, I need to get back up there. And I was like, what? No.
During
it
the
doesn't
hurricane?
work that, like, during the hurricane, yeah. And so when Hurricane Ian came, because he lives down in Bradenton, which is not that close to where the hurricane went, but he said it sounded like a freight train, and it was probably the scariest thing. And my dad's a Marine, so he's a pretty tough cookie. And he was like, it was the house was shaking. It sounded really scary. And he's like, and I couldn't have gotten on that roof to put anything. He's like, but I didn't realize that. He's like, now I know, and I will evacuate. There's no way I would stay there. And that wasn't even the line of path of the hurricane. So even hearing him say that, like, if you knew my dad, he's like really tough, very independent, very like, and for him to say, Elizabeth, you were right. I should have left. I should have came, you know, to your house or whatever. That's not something I want to ever experience again. Like, that really resonates with me, you know, so.
But it's crazy to think that's your father. He knows what you do, and he didn't evacuate, to show you how stubborn we are as individuals.
People are very stubborn. You can kind of,
question to that.
I'm going to repeat it.
You said you've done some research on it. Did you find in your research, like, I would think that a big burden to evacuation is like the financial burden that comes along to evacuation.
of course,
So, like,
yeah.
Is that something that?
Yeah, so like transportation.
In your research, did you find that the financial burden, it's this, Mike. Did you find that the financial burden to evacuation had a part to play in why people didn't evacuate?
Yes, definitely. So, you know, those that don't have the resources or the income or the social connections or or transportation. All of those are, and a big one also is having pets and having a plan for your pets. So there's a lot of factors that do influence that. I mean, we saw that with Hurricane Katrina. Majority of those that did not evacuate were those that couldn't because of financial barriers and because of those constraints. So, we're trying to, everything that we do is really trying to focus on how can we do better in terms of not only giving that education and that knowledge, but how do we build up those communities that can support that response. So I know the health department, for example, has a special needs registry where they try to focus on those with special medical needs where they're not quite the level of needing hospital care, but they can get evacuated using transportation from the county to get them out of their home and into a special needs shelter. There's some programs to help residents get out of, on the bus line and not have to pay for the buses to get to the nearest shelter. We try to encourage those things as much as possible. Now, I want to say our shelters were packed during Hurricane Irma. Packed, like over capacity, a lot of them. And for some reason, since the pandemic, we've seen a decline in the use of shelters. And a lot of that might be because of that fear of, contracting an infectious disease or whatever the case may be. Or, Hurricane Irma was extremely scary in terms of it being a Category 5 out in the Atlantic and it heading, straight up the center of Florida and then coming, like whipping around here to Tampa. So I think that was a huge fear factor, but it's kind of interesting seeing the response to that and how much of a mass exodus out of the state of Florida. I think we had 60,000 people exit the state of Florida at that time. 60,000, no, 6 million, was it? Something like that. But it was like the largest in history. And so we had a large number. But ever since then, the shelters haven't been nearly as full. So even with Hurricane Ian. And a lot of that might be because all of a sudden I diverted and people were trying to make a last minute decision because that's what we saw in our research. But unfortunately, we just need to make sure people understand if they wait too long, that's going to be a problem. But then again, we need to do better in making sure that we're looking at different pockets of the community and how we can better support them in their evacuation decision. So it's one thing saying, yes, I'm going to evacuate or you should evacuate, but how do you take that next step to make sure they can evacuate? And I think that's a big challenge that we still have to overcome. So that question comes like twofold. It's like, I don't think that people are necessarily hesitant because a lot of times they follow their communities and that advice. But if you don't give them the resources to be able to do so, that's where we fall short. For sure.
Any other questions? Yeah, Nick?
What's the number one thing we could do now for future disasters in order to better prepare, both in planning or preparation?
So what's the number one thing that we could do in future disasters now that we can, it's hard to repeat these questions, to plan and better prepare?
Yeah. So for me, I think that each business in Hillsborough County needs to have a disaster role in mind, like whether they're supporting, local government or whether they're supporting maybe a nonprofit or initiative or something that aligns with their business model. And also having a plan, a continuity plan where they really do think about, what could happen to their business and how they're going to recover. Because if we don't come back economically and people don't have jobs, that's where people are going to start exiting to go find work or put their kids back into school, and we're going to lose a segment of our population. We see it in a lot of disaster-affected areas where people just abandon their homes or abandon the situation and leave. Another thing is affordable housing. I'm going to kind of throw that out there because we're already having a problem with affordable housing in disaster-affected areas. Unfortunately, we see a lot where landlords that were already kind of slumlords to begin with will say, well, my house these units were affected by the hurricane. We need to kick these people out and cause them to be homeless so that we can, rebuild our property and then make it better, take insurance money, whatever they plan to do. And unfortunately, when they do that, or if structures are completely demolished and they rebuild them like new, a lot of those homes that may have been affordable at one point, where people that were like the fabric of that community, living in that community, that have been in that community for generations, are now pushed out of those communities because now they've rebuilt and the price point is at, that house is $400,000, not, worth, maybe that wasn't as, worth, financially, I guess, costly. And so now all those individuals that lived in those neighborhoods we see all the time that are now pushed out and they have nowhere to go, or they have to find somewhere to go, or they are pushed out of the community altogether to try and find somewhere else. So I think the affordable housing situation right now, it has a rippling effect in disaster times, unfortunately. And so that's a big, big problem in terms of getting back in recovering. So I personally would like to see a recovery plan of knowing exactly which neighborhoods would probably be heavily affected in our community, and having a plan of what that reconstruction would look like if we had to rebuild. Like, how can we create those redundancies or build back better so that we aren't faced with more issues with affordable housing? That way we're not displacing people out of the communities that they've lived in for generations because of their income level, and making sure that people are supported, on all levels of,
Socioeconomic spectrum.
Exactly.
Yeah.
All levels of need too, so, in their recovery. Yeah.
All right, I'll open it up one last time. And if there's nothing else, I want to thank you for being here today.
Yeah.
I learned so much, and I hope everybody else did too. And I hope that these continue to be kind of channels for this kind of learning, because there's just so much we don't know. And especially in something as important as how much your field affects our everyday life in Tampa Bay, I really, really appreciate you sharing all that knowledge.
Yeah.
And thank you to Blind Tiger. Taylor just walked away, but thank you to Blind Tiger for hosting us, because we do have to be out of here at 8. So thanks, Taylor. I appreciate you hanging out and listening to us.
Thank you.
And for Blind Tiger in general for partnering us on these. They're donating this space. They're partners. They're not like landlords in this event. Oh, and sorry, I didn't see you over there. But we really do appreciate Roberto and their whole team for seeing the value in these conversations as well.
Okay.
So thank you.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
Anything you want to say?
I just want to make, hopefully just inspire people to think about, how disasters will affect them and how they can be part of that community. That's how we're going to build that resilience. And so just knowing, disasters don't not affect some people, they affect everybody, especially at the community level and depending on what hazards you're faced with. So we just need to be aware of that and make sure that we're building to that level or that standard where we will build back or come back better.
Well, big round of applause. Thanks for being here.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Yeah. The end.